The wolf had not moved in 11 nights. Not pacing. Not feeding. Not doing any of the things the behavioral files said wolves did in the dark hours when the facility was quiet and the corridor lights threw their amber wash over everything and nobody was watching except the man paid to watch. She was watching him back. Riven Thorne stopped walking. He was 30 years old and he had the face of someone who had been 30 for longer than the calendar suggested, angular jaw, slightly hollowed cheeks, the particular leanness of a man whose body had decided that carrying extra weight was a luxury the situation didn't permit. His deep-set eyes were a steely, washed-out gray, the kind of gray that had some hunter in it, some permanently unresolved wariness that sat behind the iris like sediment that never quite settled. His dark brown hair was short and slightly damp at the edges, pushed back from his forehead in the absent-minded way of a man who had stopped thinking about his appearance somewhere around night 4 and had not thought about it since. The faint stubble along his jaw was a shade heavier than it had been at the start of the shift. Above his right eyebrow, pale against his light-tan skin, a small scar caught the headlamp's beam, an old mark, long-healed, belonging to a different chapter of his life that he had not shared with anyone in Ravenfall Valley. His brow furrowed. It did that when something demanded processing his current categories couldn't cleanly handle. The crease between his eyes went deep, pulling at the scar above the brow, and his jaw set tighter, and he stood there in the amberlit dark of the feeding corridor in his dark tactical jacket and his olive cargo pants and his mud-caked boots, headlamp throwing a pale cone through the space between him and Enclosure 7's fence line, and he looked at the wolf and the wolf looked back at him. She was brown-gray. Medium build for the species, though she carried herself with a stillness that made size feel irrelevant. The intake files called her Doe. He had read the name on his third night and found it quietly wrong in a way he couldn't immediately explain. Not a wolf's name, not a designation that carried any of the clinical distance the rest of the facility's documentation maintained. A person's nickname. The kind of name someone gave something they were trying not to get attached to and had gotten attached to anyway. Her eyes returned the sodium light flat and without the reflective depth animal eyes usually held in low-light conditions. She was standing at the inner fence with her body fully oriented toward him. Not toward the corridor in general, not toward the headlamp as a moving light source in the dark, but toward Riven specifically. Toward his face. She had been doing this for 11 consecutive nights. He had stopped pretending it was normal behavior by night 6. He stood for a moment that extended past what the check required. Then he exhaled through his nose, quiet, controlled, and walked on. This was his 18th night. Back in the booth, he sat in the plastic chair with a cracked left strut and looked at the window. The glass was old, slightly warped, the kind that produced mild distortions and reflected surfaces. He had noticed this on his first night and filed it under building maintenance and thought nothing further of it until night 9, when he had caught his own reflection mid-shift and found it doing something that warped glass alone did not explain. It was small. It was the kind of thing a tired man on a night shift in a facility that already unsettled him could easily attribute to fatigue or bad lighting or the particular quality of the sodium amber coming through from the corridor. He had attributed it to all three. He had done this on night 9 and on night 11 and on night 14 and he was doing it now on night 18 with decreasing conviction each time. His reflection moved with him. It did what reflections did. But in certain moments, not every moment, not predictably, not in a way he could demonstrate to anyone, it was a half-beat behind. Not the lag of a man turning quickly. A slower lag. A lag with something almost like reluctance in it, as if the reflection were being pulled rather than simply following. He had not logged this. He had not told anyone. He looked away from the window and looked at the intake binder on the right side of the desk. 43 files. He had been sitting with the arithmetic for 2 days now. The facility's intake binder listed 43 animals. The missing persons records for Ravenfall Valley, accessed on his own data, on the search the facility's network had been specifically configured to prevent, listed 43 names. He thought about the wolf at the fence. He thought about the way she watched him, Not the way an animal watched, not with the tracking instinct of a predator reading movement, but with something that had a quality of recognition in it that he could not attribute to any behavioral literature he had ever read. He thought about his reflection and stopped thinking about it. He picked up the pen. He held it over the anomaly section of the night's log. He sat there in the irregular warmth of the space heater for a long time. Then he put the pen down. Not yet. He needed to understand what he was holding before he said its name. Outside, the Vel moved over its rock shelf with its low, continuous, almost vocal sound. The sodium light swayed. Doe stood at the fence and faced the booth window and did not move. 43. 43. On the left corner of the desk, exactly where it had been since night one, sat Cully Fenn's thermos. Left behind with his coat and his keycard and his forwarding address that had turned out to be disconnected. The thermos of a man who had stood in this booth and seen something and made a calculation about it and simply stopped coming back. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his reflection in the warped window glass. The reflection looked back. It was a half-beat slow. The village of Riven Thorne had been dying for longer than anyone still living there could remember beginning to notice. He had driven through it on his first afternoon, before the night shift, before the facility, before the arithmetic now sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't put down, and clocked it the way he clocked most things, methodically and without sentiment. A single gas lamp main road with dead lamps at both ends that nobody had replaced. A shuttered church, its signage weathered past legibility, a single vertical crack running the full height of its front wall as if the building had decided to begin a very slow and deliberate division of itself. A general store open between hours posted on a handwritten card that changed week to week. Houses set back from the road at intervals that suggested a denser population had once existed and had thinned without anyone adjusting the spacing of what remained. 200 people more or less. Once 600. The difference had not happened all at once. It had happened in the slow, unremarked way of places that lose people gradually enough that each departure can be explained individually, until one day the cumulative weight of all the individual explanations becomes impossible to ignore. Mrs. Galt had been one of the ones who stayed. She was a compact, deliberate woman of late middle age who ran her house with the efficient minimalism of someone who had made peace with the fact that most things were temporary. She rented him the back room without asking many questions. The one question she had asked, whether he was religious on his first evening, over tea she had made without asking if he wanted it, had lingered longer than he expected. He had said no. She had looked at him with an expression he could not fully read and said simply, "You might want to reconsider." Then she changed the subject to the heating system's quirks and they had not discussed it again. Her kitchen light was always on when he came home at 6 in the morning. Always. Without exception. He had noted this as a fact without a category and left it there. On the fourth night he had met Silvara Keir properly for the first time. He had seen her briefly on nights 2 and 3, crossing the administration building car park, disappearing inside before he had the opportunity for more than a nod. But on night 4 she came to the booth at 11:30 with a cold thermos of her own coffee, 2 sets of updated facility documentation, and the self-contained composure of someone who had been doing this for long enough that late nights in a wolf facility no longer registered as unusual. She was 34 years old and she moved through the facility with the purposeful, slightly compressed energy of a person who had learned to function at full capacity in a space that did not give her enough room. Her oval face was fine-featured, high cheekbones catching the sodium light as she came through the corridor and into the booths overhead, her deep green eyes moving over the room with the quick assessing quality he had noticed on their first meeting and had not stopped noticing since. The eyes were the kind of green that held different things in different light. In the corridor they went almost colorless, something glass-cold in them, but in the enclosed warmth of the booth they were fully themselves, a deep and slightly wary green that was always doing the particular kind of looking that went several layers past the surface of whatever it was aimed at. Her dark auburn hair was tied back. It had been neat when she arrived, always neat when she arrived, A long dark tie holding most of it back from her oval face with the precision of someone for whom this was part of a deliberate professional presentation. But the work she did in the administration building showed at the edges of her. Several strands of dark auburn had come loose and fell now across the right side of her face, one crossing her cheekbone, one curling near the faint scar at her temple, a pale mark barely visible against her fair skin, thin and old and belonging to a question he had not yet found the right moment to ask. Her thin arched eyebrows were drawn fractionally together. The loose strands moved slightly as she walked and she did not push them back. She wore a charcoal-fitted jacket, edges slightly worn with the wearing in of long regular use, over dark trousers that were practical without being careless, and low-heeled boots that made almost no sound on the booth's floor. In her left hand she carried papers against her chest, edges slightly curled from handling. Her right hand held a pen, its cap smudged with ink near the clip, not from a single use but from the repeated motion of someone removing and replacing it one-handed while the other hand was already full of something else. She set the documentation on the desk, poured coffee into the thermos cap without asking whether he wanted it, and looked at him with those deep green wary eyes and said, "I should walk you through the filing system." Not a question. The statement of a person who had decided something before arriving. He let her walk him through it. She was precise, thorough, economical with her words in the specific way of someone who had learned that extra words created extra questions, and she was not always in a position to answer extra questions. The filing system was logical. The documentation categories were clearly labeled. The behavioral assessment protocols were detailed and professionally formatted. He read them all that night after she left. He found the notation on the third file he opened, written in a different hand, different ink, tucked beneath the standard vitals sheet. Still trying to speak. Restrict soft food, jaw movement stimulus. He read it 3 times. He put it back exactly where he found it. He did not mention it to her the next morning. That was his first mistake, or what he would later consider his first mistake. The first decision he made in Ravenfall Valley that had a cost he had not fully calculated at the time of making it. The nights accumulated. Night 5. The bell ran louder than wind conditions explained, and all 12 wolves oriented north simultaneously at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, held it for 11 minutes, and returned to their previous positions at the same moment as if released. He documented it. He did not find a satisfying explanation. Night 6. He counted the dead camera housings for the first time. 6 working, 6 dead. Not malfunctioning, the cables had been cut. Clean cuts, deliberate, the kind requiring a tool rather than resulting from wear. He documented, camera housings, right side perimeter, cables severed, appears intentional. He filed it under maintenance concerns and said nothing. Night 7. She arrived at 20 past 11 and he asked her directly about the cameras. She paused in the way she paused when choosing footing. Her charcoal jacket was zipped higher that night, the worn collar up, and several strands of dark auburn had come loose earlier than usual, a sign he was beginning to understand of work that loosened things. She looked at him with those green eyes doing their complicated calculation and said, "The animals in those enclosures were distressed by being watched." He said, "That's the point of the cameras." She said, "The animals in those specific enclosures were distressed in a way that indicated awareness of surveillance. We made an ethical decision." Pause. Then quietly, leaving a door open rather than walking through it, "You'll understand that differently in a few weeks." She left before he could respond. He sat in the booth for the rest of the shift turning that sentence over. "You'll understand that differently. Not more. Not better. Differently." As if what he was currently applying to the situation was not an insufficient amount of the right framework but the wrong framework entirely. He went home at 6 and Mrs. Galt's kitchen light was on and she was already at the table when he came through the door. He went to the back room and lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about his reflection in the warped window glass until he fell asleep. He dreamed about the corridor. About walking it alone. About the amber lights throwing shadows that moved without wind, and about the sound of something in the dark that was not quite a wolf and not quite a voice and was trying very hard to be both. He did not write this down anywhere. Night 11 was the night he found the marks. The rain had come down earlier that evening and softened the ground along the fence lines into the particular receptive mud that held impressions longer than mud should. He had been on the 1 in the morning perimeter walk, passing enclosure 7, when his headlamp caught a disturbance in the ground near the inner fence base. Not digging. The ground was too packed at the base for digging. The disturbance was surface level, organized, deliberate, something having moved across the top of the mud in a controlled pattern. He crouched. His olive cargo pants pulled tight at the knee. He brought the headlamp low. The flickering was more pronounced at that angle, the beam dipping and steadying in a rhythm that made the shadows jump, and he held very still until the light stabilized and showed him what was in the mud. Letters. Arranged in a rough grid of small repeated indentations, dragged at even intervals with something narrow. A claw tip, controlled, deliberate, applying measured pressure. His name. Riven. His angular jaw tightened. The furrow between his eyes went deep, pulling at the scar above his brow. He stayed crouched for what he later estimated was close to 2 minutes, his steely gray eyes moving over the letters with the flat, unreacting attention of a man whose instinct was to absorb first and respond second. His name. Not on any external signage. Appearing, to his knowledge, only on the internal staff roster he had never seen posted anywhere accessible in the facility. He photographed it. He did not log it. He went back to the booth and opened the intake binder to enclosure 7's file and read the full entry for Doe for the first time. Standard and sterile through most of its length. Then near the bottom, almost as a footnote in her precise handwriting. Subject shows persistent investigative interest in new personnel. Behavior appears communicative in intent. Origin of behavior, unknown. He sat with that for the rest of the shift. Then he went home at 6 in the morning and came through the door, and Mrs. Galt was at the kitchen table as always, and she looked up at him and looked back down at her tea and said, without preamble, without looking up again, "You've been going near the north enclosures." He said, "That's most of my perimeter walk." She said nothing further. She got up and put her cup in the sink. Before she left the kitchen she stopped with her back to him and said, "The ones at the north end remember more than the others. Be careful what you give them to remember about you." Then she went upstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. Night 14 was the night she left her keycard on the desk. He waited 20 minutes after her car left the lot. He sat with the cracked strut pressing into his back and looked at the keycard and had a straightforward internal conversation about what he was about to do and why and what it would cost. Then he picked it up, put it in the breast pocket of his tactical jacket, and walked to the administration building. His own card had never worked on the sublevel B door. Hers returned green. The door opened. Sublevel B was a single corridor 8 meters long, lined on both sides with gray steel filing cabinets under fluorescent lights, of which one, the far one above the bolted door at the corridor's end, was dead. The cold hit him immediately 4 degrees below the floor above, immediate and total. The floor was poured concrete with a single-channel groove running its center length, a drain dry, smelling faintly of copper. The filing cabinets made a low resonant hum in the frequency of the wind transmitting through the building's structure into the metal. He opened the nearest cabinet. 43 folders. He read 7 before he heard the generator shed door open outside. Each folder contained 2 documents. A standard wildlife intake form on top, and beneath it, clipped to the inside back cover, a second document on older paper. Typed on what appeared to be a typewriter, the impression of the keys still visible as slight indentations in the page. The second documents were not wildlife records. Name. Last known address. Occupation. Family contacts. And at the bottom of each, in identical formatting. Transition confirmed. Memory retention, partial/full/none. The status circled in red ink. Different on every folder. He replaced everything. He went back to the booth. He sat for 40 minutes without logging anything. At 3 in the morning he did his perimeter walk and Barrow was at the fence for the first time. Not pacing. So, facing him with an expression the narrator's available vocabulary had nothing clean for. Not animal recognition, not predatory assessment. Something older than either. The expression of something that knew exactly what it was looking at and had been waiting for the looking to be mutual. He stood at enclosure 12 and looked at the black wolf in the amber light, and his brow was deeply furrowed and his jaw was set and the scar above his eyebrow caught the light and the torn cuff of his jacket rested against the chain link and the flickering headlamp threw uneven shadows across both of them. He understood with the clarity of a man who had been building toward a conclusion for 14 nights that he had run out of alternative explanations. He understood something else too, standing there, that the reflection in the booth window had been doing what it had been doing for 9 nights now, and that Mrs. Galt had told him to be careful what he gave the north enclosure wolves to remember about him, and that he had not yet asked himself the question those two facts together were pointing toward. He asked it now. Standing at the fence in the amber dark with the black wolf watching him with human patience, he asked himself, "What is already happening to me?" He had no answer. He went back to the booth and sat down and his hands, for the first time across 14 nights, the first time he allowed it, were not entirely steady. He pressed them flat on the desk and waited until they were. It took longer than it should have. He noted this without writing it down and then sat in the irregular warmth of the space heater and listened to the valley breathe and did not look at the window. Night 15. He was standing at the administration building door when she arrived. She stopped at the car park edge, charcoal jacket's worn collar up against the cold, dark auburn hair tied back with the strands already loosening at the sides of her oval face, green eyes sharp and wary in the sodium light as they moved from the door to him to the expression on his angular face and back. She held her papers against her chest with both hands. Her smudged pen was clipped to the top of the folder. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "You went downstairs." Not a question. He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The loose strands of dark auburn moved in the cold wind off the ridge. Her thin arched brows were together, not in anger but in the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation for longer than the conversation has technically existed, now calculating how to have it without doing more damage than the not having it already had. She said, "Come inside." They sat in the small break room off the main administration corridor, the only room in the building with a table and 2 chairs and a kettle that worked, and she made tea that neither of them drank and set it between them and folded her hands over her folder and looked at him with those deep green eyes doing something more complicated than he had seen them do before. Not the calculation he had come to recognize. Something beneath it. Something that looked, under the wary professional surface, like exhaustion so deep it had become structural. Like a person who had been holding a building upright with their hands for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like not to be holding something. She told him. Not everything. Not in a single unbroken confession. She was too careful for that, too practiced in the management of information. She told it in pieces, the way a structural engineer describes a building that is still standing but shouldn't be, with the particular care of someone who needs you to understand the weight-bearing elements before you can understand why none of it has collapsed. The facility had been established by a researcher named Dr. Aldrich Voss, who came to Riven Thorne Valley following reports of unusual physiological anomalies in the local population, reports circulating in certain very specific and very unindexed research communities for longer than Voss had been alive. He arrived with government-adjacent funding from a source never publicly identified and never needing to be, because the facility had never been publicly acknowledged in any way that required accountability. Voss had not created what happened in Riven Thorne Valley. He had been precise about this in his documentation, and she was precise about it now, her tight-lipped expression loosening slightly around the edges as she spoke, one strand of auburn falling across her high cheekbone and staying there. The valley had been doing what it did before he arrived. The transformation mechanism, vector unclear, possibly the valley itself, possibly something in the soil chemistry near the well, possibly something that had no category in any framework either of them had been trained in, predated him by a long margin. He arrived in time to document it, to build enclosures, to ensure that the people who went through it didn't simply disappear into the valley and starve. This was, she said quietly, looking at her untouched tea, the most charitable reading of what Voss had done. She did not offer a less charitable reading. She didn't need to. He spent years attempting reversal. He did not achieve it. He died, of natural causes, his documentation noted, though the documentation had been written by himself and so carried a certain limited authority, and left behind 43 subjects, a filing system, and a sealed room at the end of sublevel B that she had opened once and not opened since. She arrived as a graduate researcher sometime after his death, brought in by the funding body to assess whether the facility should continue operating or be. The word the brief used was resolved. She discovered the files. She read them. She sat in sublevel B for what she later calculated was 3 hours and made a decision she had been living inside ever since. She stayed. Because by the time she arrived, 8 of the 43 had demonstrated clear evidence of retained human memory. Because the files in that cabinet were the only record that these people had ever existed. Because someone had to maintain the feeding logs and keep the documentation current and know who was in there, and if she left nobody would, and the funding body's preferred alternative to her staying was the word resolved, and she had a very clear understanding of what that word meant in this context. She had told this to no one before. She had rehearsed it in the years before he arrived, in the way you rehearse things you believe you will never actually say, not to prepare for saying them but to keep them from dissolving entirely in the silence. The telling felt different from the rehearsal. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. She had expected relief. What she felt instead was the specific vertigo of a person who has been leaning against a wall for so long that when the wall moves they cannot immediately find their balance. She looked at him across the table. Several loose strands of dark auburn had fallen fully across her face now, obscuring one green eye slightly, and she didn't move them. The faint scar at her temple was visible in the overhead light, pale and old against her fair skin. Her thin arched brows were level. Her expression had moved all the way past the tight-lipped concealment into something on the other side of it, the specific openness of a person who has put down something very heavy and is not yet sure what to do with their hands. She said, Doe was a welfare worker from the village. Her name was Marin. She had been looking into the disappearances, the missing persons cases that had been filed and gone nowhere for years. She got too close to the valley's northern section. Pause. She was in an enclosure by the following spring. His gray eyes were steady. His jaw was set. The furrow between his brows was deep. He said, She wrote my name in the mud. She said, I told her someone new was coming. That he seemed like a careful person. A decent one. Her eyes held his. She wanted to know if you could be trusted. A long silence. The kettle had gone cold. Outside, the Vel ran over its rock shelf and the sodium lights threw amber through the break room's single high window. He said, What does full retention mean? In practice. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, It means they are still entirely themselves. Where? Continuous. They remember their lives, their families, everything. Her voice was level and had been level throughout, and the levelness was its own kind of information. Marin is full retention. She has been full retention for every day she has been in that enclosure. He sat with this. The space heater ticked. He said, What do they want? She was quiet for a moment. The loose strands of her dark auburn moved slightly in a draft from the window sill. Then she said, quietly, in the voice of someone giving an answer they have been holding for a very long time without anyone to give it to, the same thing anyone wants who has been locked up for longer than they can count. They want someone to know they're in there. They want to be counted. He nodded once. Then he said, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it directly. She looked at him. Something in her green eyes went very still. He said, The reflection in the booth window. The lag. I've been seeing it for 9 nights. Is that something that happens to people who work here? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. He counted them. She said, "It can happen. In the early stages. To people with certain susceptibilities." She paused. "It doesn't mean the transition has begun. It means the valley has noticed you." He looked at the table. Then he looked back at her. He said, "How do I know the difference?" She said, "I'll tell you. But you need to keep coming back. And you need to keep logging everything." He said, "All right." She said, "All right." They did not discuss it further that night. But the tea that had gone cold between them on the table felt, when he finally stood to leave, like something more than tea, like the residue of a conversation that had changed the shape of what came after it. Night 16 he came back. He came back because there was no version of the man he understood himself to be that didn't. He came back because the alternative was to sit in the back room at Mrs. Galt's house and look at the ceiling and know that 43 people were in those enclosures and something might be starting to happen to him, and he was the only person outside this facility who knew either of those things. He did his first and second perimeter walks. He documented. He maintained the routine because the routine was the framework inside which everything else was becoming possible. At 20 minutes to 3 he took his personal notebook from his cargo pants pocket and walked to enclosure 12 and sat down on the cold gravel with his back against the fence post and waited. Barrow came to the fence slowly. The black wolf moved with the full weight of his size, unhurried, and stopped at the inner fence 2 feet from his position. His dark eyes were level with the eyeline of a man sitting on the ground. In the sodium amber, from this close, those eyes held something that had no clean professional language, and he had stopped trying to find one. He looked at the folder entry in his notebook. The name he had found there. He said, "Joran." The wolf's eyes changed. Not a flinch, not a startle, not the alerting response of an animal to a novel stimulus. The change was human. The specific involuntary shift in the eyes when a person hears their own name in a place they had stopped expecting to hear it. Recognition landing in a face that had not been prepared for it and could not fully contain it. He sat there on the cold gravel in his dark tactical jacket and his muddy boots with his slightly torn cuff resting on his knee, headlamp dimming at the edges, and talked. He did not plan what he said. He said the things that were available. The drive into Ravenfall Valley, the way the valley's weight had been noticeable before he understood what it was. Mrs. Galt's kitchen light. The thermos on the desk. The sound of the bell at night that was almost a voice. Small things. Recent things. The available inventory of a life in progress, offered without agenda to a man who was living an entirely different kind of being present in the same valley. Joran stayed at the fence for the full hour. He did not move away. He did not make a sound. The silence between them was the most honest thing Riven had experienced in Ravenfall Valley. Night 17. Silvara opened the bolted door herself. She came to the booth first, charcoal jacket, dark trousers, low-heeled boots, nearly silent on the gravel, papers under her arm, green eyes already doing the assessment before she was fully through the door. Her auburn hair was more loosened than usual, several strands across both sides of her oval face, the faint temple scar catching the overhead light. She set the papers down and looked at him and said simply, "Come down with me." Sublevel B received them in its cold. 4 degrees lower immediately, the copper smell rising from the dry drain, the cabinets humming their low-frequency hum. Her boots were precise on the uneven concrete as she moved to the bolted door. Her smudged pen was in her jacket pocket. She put both hands on the bolt and drew it back. The room was approximately 4 meters by 4. 3 walls of shelving held glass specimen jars, most empty, a few holding preserved material and yellowed fluid that neither of them examined. A cot, folded, against the 4th wall. In the corner a typewriter on a small desk with an ink ribbon still loaded and a single sheet of paper in the roller. Beside the typewriter, a handwritten note in cramped but legible script. Silvara stood back. He read the note. It was from Voss. Written in the final year of his life, in the particular prose of a man who had given up writing for an audience and was writing for the record. He wrote about the valley with the precision of long study and the humility of someone who had come to understand the limits of his own framework. The valley was not his discovery. The mechanism was not his creation. He had arrived at something already in progress, imposed structure on it in the form of enclosures and documentation and a fiction of wildlife conservation, and had spent the years since living in the increasingly uncomfortable understanding that structure was not the same thing as help. He described the subjects with the care of someone who had known them, not by folder names, by actual names. Marin, the welfare worker who had been trying to find the missing when she joined them. A schoolteacher named Corvin Fell who had taught most of the village's children and whose enclosure the other wolves tended to position themselves near. 2 brothers, Aldous and Pell Marsh, who had gone into the valley's northern section together and whose folders sat adjacent in the cabinet as they had apparently, through Marin's communication system, insisted upon. An old man the village had called Scratch who had lived rough near the valley's edge for years before the transition completed, whose actual name the folder gave as Henrik Dow, who had known on some level what was coming and had not left. Near the end of the note, in smaller script, Voss wrote about his own peripheral vision. The way it had begun to change in his later years. The specific distortions at the edge of things. He did not dramatize this. He noted it as data carefully for whoever came after. He wrote, "If you are reading this and you have begun to notice similar distortions, I want you to know that the valley's attention is not the same as the valley's claim. There is a period, the length varies, during which the process can be interrupted. I do not know how to interrupt it. I spent years trying to find out. But I want it on record that the window exists. That is the one thing I was able to confirm." The last sentence ended mid-word. He set the note down. He opened the desk drawer. In the back, behind dried-out correction pens and a rubber band that disintegrated when he touched it, there was a 44th folder. The tab read, Voss, I. The memory retention status, circled in Voss's own handwriting, circled before the need arose to circle it, read, full. He stood in the 4-degree cold of the sealed room for a long time. The copper smell came up from the drain in the corridor outside. The dead fluorescent at the far end through the bolted door into near darkness behind him, and Silvara waited near the cabinets with her arms folded. Not from cold, from the posture of a person watching someone absorb something she had absorbed long ago and had been carrying ever since. He thought about Enclosure 1. The gray-white wolf with the amber eyes that were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with age. He thought about the fact that Voss had been trying to find out how to interrupt the process. He thought about the fact that the note had been written for whoever came after, and that whoever came after appeared for the moment to be him. He closed the drawer. He replaced the folder. He walked back down the corridor. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "He's in Enclosure 1. She said, "Yes." He said, "Full retention." She said, "Yes. He's been there since before I arrived. He was the one who taught Marin the communication system. She taught it to the others." A long silence. He said, "How long have you been doing this alone?" She looked at the cabinet nearest her. A strand of dark auburn crossed her high cheekbone. The faint scar at her temple was pale in the fluorescent cold. Then she said, "Long enough that the alone part stopped feeling like the hardest part." He didn't ask what the hardest part was. He thought he understood. He thought about the reflection in the booth window. About Voss's note. About the window that existed, the length of which varied. He went back upstairs and noted in his private notebook, in the neat compressed hand of a man keeping records that mattered, Voss confirmed the window. Find out how long. Night 18. Back where it began. The third perimeter walk. The gravel announcing him. The amber lights and moving shadows and the Vel on its rock shelf and the weight of the valley's air pressing down from the haze between the ridgelines. Enclosure 7. Doe at the fence, brown-gray and still, facing him. 11 consecutive nights. 12 after tonight. He stopped in front of her. His dark tactical jacket was damp again. Rain had come and gone at 2 in the morning, the valley's way of doing things all at once and then not at all. His muddy boots were loud in the brief silence between one gust off the ridge and the next. The torn cuff of his jacket rested against the chain link. His headlamp was dimming at the outer edge, the battery in its final days, the flickering more frequent when he turned his head. His deep-set gray eyes were level with hers. He said her name. Not Doe. Marin. She moved forward. Not quickly, slowly, the way something moves when it has been practicing restraint for so long that restraint has become the dominant physical grammar. She came to the fence and pressed her nose through the chain link gap and touched the back of his hand where it rested against the fence. He stood there and let her. He did not look at his reflection in the nearest fence post's metal surface. He was aware of it in his peripheral vision and he did not look at it. Then she stepped back, turned slowly, walked to the center of the enclosure, lowered herself to the ground with the careful deliberateness of something doing an unfamiliar thing and remembering how. She slept. As far as he could tell, it was the first time in weeks. He stood at the fence for another few minutes in the amber dark, the Vel running its almost vocal sound in the distance, the sodium lights swaying, the shadows moving in their unreliable way across the gravel and the fence and the ground that held marks longer than it should. His angular jaw was not set. His brow was not furrowed. His steely gray eyes were quiet in a way they were rarely quiet on the third perimeter walk of the night. He walked on. A week passed the way weeks passed in Ravenfall Valley, not by any measure he had brought with him, but by accumulation. By the texture of the nights layering over each other, each one a degree different from the last, the progression measurable only in the slow shift of what had become normal. He checked his reflection every shift now. Systematically. Booth window at the start of the shift, at the midpoint, and before leaving at 6. He logged the lag with the same precision he applied to everything else. It was not getting worse. It was not getting better. It was consistent in a way that felt, if not reassuring, then at least stable, like a wound that had stopped bleeding without closing. He had asked Silvara on night 20 whether Voss had documented the progression rate in any of the folders he had access to. She had looked at him with those green eyes very still and said, "It varies by individual. Some people the valley notices and releases. Some it holds." Pause. Voss believed the determining factor was whether the person had something unfinished here. Something they came to do. He had sat with that. He thought he understood what he had come to do. Night 23. He checked the reflection at the midpoint of the shift as he always did. He stood at the booth window for 30 seconds and turned his head left and turned it back and counted the lag the way he had been counting it for weeks. It was longer. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else would have noticed or that his log entry could render with precision. But longer than the night before in a way he could not attribute to fatigue or the quality of the ambient light. He wrote in his private notebook, "Lag increasing." Then he sat with the pen in his hand for a long time before he put it down and went back to the perimeter walk. He did not tell Silvara. Not yet. But he walked the perimeter faster that night. Not running. Not in any way that would have been visible to anything watching from the enclosures. Just faster than usual, with the specific purposefulness of a man who has just recalibrated how much time he thinks he has and found the number smaller than he would like. On the 25th night she arrived to find the booth reorganized. Not her documentation. He had not touched her filing system. But alongside it, on the left side of the desk that had previously held only Fenn's thermos and his logged notebooks, there was a secondary system. A parallel record supplementing rather than replacing hers. Each of the 43 folders now had a corresponding document in his system. Everything he had been able to find from public records and accessible databases about the corresponding missing person. From his own data, researched across the past 7 nights in the pre-dawn hours when the perimeter walks were done and the valley settled into its deepest quiet. Family information. Last known sightings. Whether a case was still active. Whether anyone was still looking. She stood at the desk and looked at it for a long time. She didn't touch anything. Her charcoal jacket was zipped high, the worn edges at the collar catching the overhead light. Her dark auburn hair was tied back and already loosening, several strands across her high cheekbones, one touching the pale scar at her temple. Her deep green eyes moved over his documentation with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the calculation, not the concealment, not the exhausted openness of the break room. Something quieter than all of those. Something that looked, in the uncertain light of the booth, like relief so old it had almost forgotten what it was. She said, "This cannot leave the facility." He said, "It needs to eventually." She said, "I know. But there are people who receive quarterly reports on this facility's operational status. People who have not asked detailed questions because the answers have never given them reason to. If they become aware that the documentation scope has expanded, that someone outside the facility's existing personnel has developed independent records," she stopped. Her green eyes were very still. "They will send someone to resolve the question of whether continued operation is the optimal outcome." He said, "How long do we have before the next report?" She said, "Not long enough." A silence settled between them that was different from the silences before it. Heavier in a specific way, the weight not of things unknown but of things known and not yet acted on, which was its own particular pressure. She said, "In the early years a family from the village came to the facility. Their son had gone missing. They drove up the access road and knocked on the administration building door, and I sent them away because I didn't know how to. I didn't have anything I could give them." She stopped. A strand of auburn fell across her cheekbone. The faint smudge of ink on her pen cap caught the light as she set her folder down. She said, "I've thought about that often." He was quiet for a moment. His gray eyes were on her face. Then he said, "We could tell them he's here." That he stopped. The word needed for the end of that sentence was not a word he had. He looked for it with the methodical attention he applied to things that resisted categorization, and he did not find it in any register available to him. She said, "Alive." Simply, without decoration. "He's alive. Most of them are." The word sat between them on the desk beside the documentation and Fenn's thermos and the logbook open to tonight's entry. Alive. Not the word for what they were. Not the word for what they had lost. But the word for what was still true, which was not nothing, which was, in the arithmetic of this valley, in this facility, in these 43 folders, the most important thing. They didn't resolve what to do. There was no resolution on night 25 because resolutions were not what the situation offered. What it offered was smaller and more durable than resolution. The act of two people sitting with the actual shape of a problem together rather than separately, which was different in kind, not just degree, from the way it had been before. He looked at Fenn's thermos. He looked back at her. He said, "Fenn's forwarding address was disconnected when I tried it." She said carefully, "Yes." He said, "The job posting went up 3 days before he gave notice." Pause. She said, "I know." He held her gaze. His angular jaw was set in the settled way of a man who has arrived at a question he is ready to ask. He said, "Who posted it?" She looked at him for a long moment. The loose strands of dark auburn hung across her face. The smudged pen was completely still in her hand. Her oval face in the overhead light was tired and precise and held, in its high cheekboned architecture, the expression of a woman deciding that tonight was the night to turn over the last card. She said, "Marin did. She found a way, the behavioral notes, the notation system, the way she positioned herself at the fence on the nights I did late documentation. It took her months to develop a communication method I could read reliably. When Fenn left, she told me to post the listing. She described what kind of person she needed." He was still. He said, "She described me." She said, "She described what she needed." "You matched it." He sat with this for a long time. Outside, the Vel ran over its rock shelf. The sodium lights threw amber through the booth window. His steely gray eyes were distant and then not distant, working through something at the pace of a man who needed to hold a thing completely before he could respond to it. Then, quietly, "She trusted me before I knew she existed." Solvara said nothing. She did not need to. He said, "She knew about the reflection too. Didn't she?" A pause so brief it was almost not a pause. She said, "Yes." He said, "And she chose me anyway." She said, "She chose you because of it." She said, "The valley doesn't notice people who aren't worth noticing." She said it had been a long time since it noticed anyone who might actually help. He looked at the window. At his reflection in the warped glass, the amber corridor behind it, and somewhere out there in enclosure 7 the brown-gray wolf sleeping in the center of her enclosure for the second consecutive night. His reflection looked back at him. It was a half-beat slow. He looked at it for a long moment and then he turned away from it and picked up his pen and opened the logbook. He had work to do. The final perimeter walk of night 25 was the one he would measure all the others against. He walked it without the headlamp. The battery had finally died between the second and third walk, going out mid-corridor with a flatness that was not dramatic, just finished, the way things ended in Ravenfall Valley without announcement. He had the replacement in his cargo pocket and he did not use it. The sodium lights were enough. The amber dark was enough. He had walked this corridor enough times that his boots knew the gravel's shape, the slight rise near enclosure 4, the give near 9, the spot at the end of the right side where the ground always held more moisture than it should. He walked it slowly. He walked it the way you walk something when you are no longer just completing a task but witnessing it. Left side. 1 through 6. He said nothing at each enclosure. But he looked. He looked with the full quality of his attention. His deep-set gray eyes unhurried, his hollowed face open in the amber light, the old scar above his brow catching the glow from the nearest pole. He looked the way someone looks when they are finally seeing what has been in front of them for the full length of time it has been there. He knew most of their names now. At enclosure 2, Corvin fell, the schoolteacher. The wolf there was medium gray, older, and when he said the name quietly the wolf raised his head from the ground and held it up for a moment before laying it back down. A small acknowledgement. The kind a person makes when they hear their name from across a room and cannot fully respond but want the caller to know they were heard. At enclosure 4, Aldous Marsh, one of the brothers. The wolf at the fence when he approached was dark-coated and carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time for this specific moment. He said the name and Aldous pressed his forehead briefly against the chain link, a gesture so unmistakably human that he had to breathe through it for a moment before moving on. At enclosure 5, Henrik Dow, who had known what was coming and stayed anyway. The oldest long-term resident outside of Voss. He was lying down when he reached the fence and he did not get up but his amber-flecked eyes tracked him the length of the fence line without moving anything else, carrying some accumulated knowledge that predated the documentation entirely. He did not say anything at enclosure 5. He stood for a moment in the amber dark and looked at Henrik Dow and nodded once, the way you nod at someone who has survived something long enough to become a kind of authority on surviving it. Then he crossed to the right side. 7 through 12. At enclosure 7 Marin was at the fence. She was always at the fence. He understood now that she had been there long before he arrived, that the fence had been the only available post from which to do the work she had decided to do, watching for someone who could be trusted, developing the communication method, writing a name in the mud when the time was right. He understood that the stillness he had read as unsettling on night 1 had been something closer to determination. The specific stillness of a person who has committed to waiting for as long as necessary. He stood at the fence with his tactical jacket's torn cuff against the chain link and his muddy boots on the cold gravel and his dead headlamp hanging at his collar and looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She pressed her nose through the chain link and briefly touched the back of his hand, the same as the night before, and then stepped back and returned to the center of the enclosure and lay down with the same careful deliberateness. At enclosure 10, Pell Marsh, the second brother. The wolf there was at the fence when he approached. He stopped. He said the name. Pell's eyes did the same thing Joran's had done on night 16. The landing of recognition, the involuntary human shift. And then the wolf sat down on the gravel in a way that was unmistakably a person sitting down and waited. He said, "I'll come back to you. I'm still working through the files." Pell sat and waited. which was what all of them did. At enclosure 12, Joran was at the fence. The black wolf stood in the amber dark with his dark eyes level and patient. He stopped and said the name once quietly. Joran's eyes did the thing they did when he heard it and then settled back into their patient watching. He walked on. At enclosure 1 he paused. The gray-white wolf with the amber eyes. Moving carefully, joints carrying their long weight. Lying down when he reached the fence, but the head coming up as he stopped. A motion that had the quality of someone who has been waiting for a specific person to arrive at a specific place and has now confirmed their arrival. The amber eyes were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with age. Sharp in the way of a man who had spent years in this facility documenting everything, who had written a note for whoever came after, who had confirmed the existence of a window and spent the rest of his life trying to find out what it was made of. He crouched down to be at eye level. He said, "I read your note." The amber eyes held everything they had learned to hold. He said, "I'm going to find the window. I'm not leaving until I do." A long moment of cold amber-lit silence. The bell ran its almost vocal sound in the distance. The fence hummed its low metallic resonance. Then Voss, the gray-white wolf, the oldest resident, the man who had built this place and been claimed by it and was still watching and waiting and retaining everything, lowered his head back to his forepaws. Slowly. With the deliberateness of something that has decided, at last, to rest. He stood. He completed the perimeter. He came back to the booth. He sat at the desk. Logbook open. Space heater ticking its irregular tick. Fence thermos on the left corner where it always was, where it would remain. A record of a predecessor. A person who had stood here and seen some portion of this and made a different calculation. He did not judge it. He understood how this valley distributed its weight differently across different people. He picked up the pen. He wrote the weather. The equipment status. The enclosure check. All present. All documented. He came to the anomaly section. He wrote, "No anomalies tonight. All 43 present and accounted for." He held the pen above the signature line. Outside the Vel ran over the rock shelf. The sodium light swayed. Marin slept in the center of enclosure 7 for the second consecutive night. Joran faced north from enclosure 12. Voss rested at enclosure 1 with his amber eyes closed for the first time in longer than Silvara had been keeping records. He signed his name. He made sure the ink had dried before he closed the logbook. He turned off the overhead light. In the dark of the booth he could see through the window the full length of the feeding corridor, amber light, moving shadows, the fence lines, the enclosures, and his own reflection in the warped glass, dim now with the overhead off, barely visible. He looked at it. It was still a half-beat slow. But it was there. And it was his. And whatever the valley thought it had noticed in him, whatever Silvara had named without fully naming, whatever Marin had seen in the description of a person and matched to him across a chain-link fence, he was still on this side of it. Still signing his name. Still closing the logbook. Still choosing. He put his hand on the booth door. Outside, somewhere beyond the tree-line edge, in the dark between the trees where the valley floor began to soften into something older than the fence, older than the facility, older than whatever Voss had believed he discovered and whatever the funding body believed it owned, something made a sound. Not a howl. The wolves inside had never howled. Not one of them. Not once across 25 nights. This was not a howl. It was smaller than a howl and more specific. The sound a voice makes when it has been a very long time since it was a voice and it is not certain it still knows how, but it is trying anyway because there is finally someone on the other side of the fence worth trying for. He heard it and he did not move. He stood at the door of the booth with his hand on the handle and the sound moved through him the way his own name moved through him when he heard it unexpectedly, not in the ears, in the chest, in the specific place where recognition lives before the mind has caught up to it. He felt the cold of the handle through his palm. He felt the valley's weight in the air and the copper smell drifting up from somewhere below the facility and the irregular tick of the space heater behind him and all of it simultaneously, the full specific texture of the place he had chosen to stay in. He stood there and he let the sound finish. Then he opened the door. The amber dark of the facility received him. The gravel announced his first step. The sodium lights swayed above the corridor and the fence lines and the 43 enclosures and the 43 presences inside them that were animals and were people and were waiting and were still here, still counting, still holding everything they had ever been in bodies that had been given no choice and minds that had refused to go with them. He turned off the dead headlamp out of habit. He listened. The valley returned its sounds, the fence's metallic resonance, the gravel settling somewhere in the corridor, the river, the weight of the air. And beneath all of it, fainter now but still there, the sound from beyond the tree line finishing itself on the cold dark air of Ravenfall Valley like a sentence that had been waiting years for someone to stay long enough to hear the end of it. He listened until it was done. He stood in the amber dark outside the booth with his torn cuff at his wrist and his muddy boots on the gravel and his angular face turned toward the tree line and his steely gray eyes open in the dark, and he made a decision that was not dramatic and was not loud and was not logged in any official record but was the most important decision he had made in Ravenfall Valley. He would find the window Voss had written about. He would find it and he would hold it open, and he would not leave until he had given every name in that filing cabinet back to the person it belonged to, or spent everything he had trying. Which, he understood now, standing in the amber dark with the valley breathing its heavy atmosphere around him, were possibly not two different outcomes. He reached into his cargo pocket. He loaded the replacement battery into the headlamp. The beam came on, full, bright, clean, throwing a strong cone down the feeding corridor all the way to the far fence line where the tree line edge was just visible beyond the outer perimeter in the dark. He walked toward it. In the guard booth, the logbook sat closed on the desk. Fence thermos on the left corner. The space heater ticking. The warped window glass reflecting the amber corridor, empty now, the gravel undisturbed. On the right side of the desk, the intake binder. 43 files. On the left side, his parallel documentation. 43 corresponding names. 43 families. 43 cases still open in databases that did not yet know they had answers. In enclosure 7, Marin slept. In enclosure 1, Voss rested with his amber eyes closed. In the feeding corridor, the headlamp's beam moved steadily north. The valley collected the sound of it, boots on gravel, steady, unhurried, a man who knew where he was going, and held it the way it held everything. It did not give it back. Not yet. He came through Mrs. Galt's door at 6 in the morning and she was at the kitchen table as always, her tea already made, her kitchen light already on, and she looked up at him when he came in and she looked at him for a long moment the way she had looked at him on the first night when she asked about religion. She said, "You went to the tree line." He said, "Yes." She looked at him carefully. At his face. At his eyes. At something she appeared to be reading in the quality of his presence in her kitchen that he did not have the framework to identify. At whatever the valley had written on him in the hours since his last shift that only someone who had been living next to Ravenfall long enough could read. Then she got up and put the kettle on again. She said, "Sit down. I'll tell you what I know. Ravenfall Valley is not on any map you will find. But if you have listened this far, you already know that some places do not need to be on maps to find the people they are looking for.